Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of a roaring ATV tearing through your private property, driven by none other than HOA Karen, the self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood. She insists she can trespass because of HOA rules. But here's the twist. I'm not even in the HOA. But when I finally decide to follow her and catch her in the act, she completely loses it, screaming trespassing at me. What happens next? Oh, just cops, lawsuits, an ATV disaster, and the most ridiculous Karen meltdown you've ever seen. Trust me, you won't believe how this one ends. So grab your popcorn because this is about to get wild. Hello, beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. The morning sun barely crests the horizon when the unmistakable roar of an ATV pierces the quiet. Every day without fail she comes barreling through, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, riding her neon pink ATV as if she owns the world. The thing is, she doesn't own my land. But that doesn't seem to matter to her. The first time it happened I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she got lost or maybe she had a legitimate reason to be here. But as she zoomed across my yard, kicking up dust and leaving deep tire tracks in my grass, I quickly realized this was no accident. She made direct eye contact with me, tilted her chin up in that unmistakable Karen confidence, and waved me off like I was the one in the wrong. Before I could say anything she was gone, her leaving behind a mess of torn-up earth in its wake. The next day it happened again. This time I stepped out onto my porch and waved her down. She revved the engine, staring at me like I was an obstacle in her path. When I called out, asking why she was cutting through my property, she scoffed. "This is an HOA-maintained trail," she said with absolute certainty. "I have every right to be here." I blinked. "What? I'm not even in the H." She waved a dismissive hand. "That doesn't matter. All paths in this neighborhood fall under HOA jurisdiction." I stared at her, dumbfounded. That's not how property ownership works. Instead of arguing, she hit the gas and took off, the roar of her ATV drowning out anything else I could say. Over the next few weeks, her rides became a daily ritual. Morning, afternoon, sometimes even at night. No matter how many times I told her to stay off my property, she always had an excuse. "The HOA rules say I can," or "this land has always been open for community use," or my personal favorite, "You're just mad because you don't have an ATV." It was like arguing with a brick wall, except this one came with an engine and an overinflated sense of entitlement. Then came the day she got stuck. It had rained the night before and the ground was still soft with mud. As she tore through my yard at full speed, her ATV hit a patch of wet soil and sank with a loud, satisfying squelch. Karen, wearing an oversized helmet that made her look like a bobblehead, flailed her arms dramatically as she tried to yank the ATV free. When she spotted me watching from my porch, she immediately pointed in my direction and shouted, "This is your fault." I raised an eyebrow. "How is this my fault?" "You should have put up a sign," she snapped. "A sign that says, 'Hey, don't drive your ATV through my yard'?" "Yes." I folded my arms. "You already know it's my property." Her face turned red. She huffed, stomped her foot, and demanded that I help push her ATV out of the mud. When I refused, she pulled out her phone, muttering about how she was going to report me to the HOA. I laughed. "Go ahead. They don't control my land." She made a big show of pretending to dial, then stormed off on foot, leaving her ATV behind. For a moment, I debated calling a tow company just to watch her pay for her mistake, but I figured letting her deal with it herself was punishment enough. As expected, she returned hours later, this time dragging her husband along. He looked tired, worn down, the kind of man who had fought many battles and lost every single one. Without saying a word to me, he helped her pull the ATV free while she barked complaints about how people in this neighborhood have no respect. After that, I decided to go to the HOA myself. Maybe, just maybe, they could do something about her. The HOA office was located in a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Inside, a handful of board members sat around a table, flipping through papers and pretending to look busy. When I explained the situation, they exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a guy named Chad, cleared his throat. "Yeah, we can't really do much about her." I frowned. "She's trespassing on my property." Another board member, a woman who looked like she regretted ever signing up for this job, sighed. "She does this to everyone. We've warned her before, but she doesn't listen." So that's it? I asked. You're just letting her do whatever she wants? Chad shrugged. His persistent. That was the understatement of the year. Outside the office, Chad caught up to me. Listen, he said in a low voice, if you really want to get her off your back, you gotta play her game. I narrowed my eyes. What do you mean? She doesn't back down unless she's forced to. She thinks HOA rules protect her, but they don't. If you push back hard enough, she'll break her own rules without realizing it. I wasn't sure what to make of that advice, but it stuck with me. That night, as I sat on my porch, listening to the distant sound of Karen's ATV revving in the distance, I realized something. If Karen wanted to play by HOA rules, then maybe it was time I did too. The next morning, the ATV roared to life once again, cutting across my property like clockwork. But this time I was ready. Instead of standing helplessly on my porch watching the destruction unfold, I decided to take a different approach. If HOA Karen believed she had the right to be on my land, then surely I had the right to follow her, right? After all, she was convinced that these so-called HOA-maintained paths were open to everyone. So I grabbed my phone, started recording, and walked straight into her world. As soon as she spotted me following her on foot, her reaction was priceless. Her helmeted head whipped around, eyes wide behind her oversized sunglasses. For a moment she seemed to panic, unsure of what to do. Then, as if flipping a switch, she twisted her expression into one of exaggerated horror and jammed on the brakes. The ATV skidded to a stop, barely avoiding toppling over. "You're trespassing," she shrieked. I stared at her, incredulous. "I'm what?" "You can't be here," she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me like she was about to call in an airstrike. "This is private property." A laugh almost escaped me. "You mean my private property?" She crossed her arms, nostrils flaring. "It's an HOA pathway and you're harassing me." "Oh, so it is private now?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Because 5 minutes ago, you were arguing it was a public trail." She turned bright red. "That's different." "How?" Instead of answering, she reached for her phone. "I'm calling the cops." I almost wanted to see how this would play out. Would she really dial 911 and tell them she was being followed by the legal owner of the property she'd been trespassing on? Spoiler alert, yes. She would. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. Karen immediately launched into a theatrical performance that deserved an Oscar. She painted me as some kind of deranged stalker, claiming I had been lurking in the bushes and chasing her down like a maniac. I let her talk. I let her spin her absurd little story, waiting for the moment when reality would crash down on her like a tidal wave. And when the officers finally turned to me, I simply held up my phone, replaying the footage of her tearing through my yard, over and over, day after day, until the realization dawned on them. The older officer exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am, is this your property?" he asked, pointing at me. Karen hesitated. Then, with the confidence of a toddler caught with cookie crumbs all over their face, she nodded. "Yes." The officer blinked. "So you own his land?" "Well, not technically. But the HOA..." The younger officer cut her off. "Ma'am, the HOA doesn't own private residences. But the rules say I can." "The rules don't override property deeds." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then she changed tactics. "Well, he was following me." "That's harassment." The older officer scratched his head, glancing at my video again. "Ma'am, he was walking on his own land. You, on the other hand, were driving through it on an ATV." Karen scoffed. "That's not the point." The officer looked at me. "Would you like to press charges for trespassing?" I pretended to consider it. Watching Karen's face morph into sheer panic was almost enough. "Almost." "Nah," I said finally. "But I will be filing a complaint with the HOA." Karen looked like she wanted to explode. The cops left, and for the first time since this whole thing began, Karen actually left without a word. No shouting. No threats. Just a quiet, fuming retreat. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that day, I received a message from one of the HOA members, Chad. It was a link to an online forum where Karen had apparently been rallying the neighborhood, claiming I was a dangerous stalker, and urging people to sign a petition to have me removed from the community. Baker? Not a single person had signed it. Not even her husband. Feeling emboldened, I decided to take things one step further. If Karen wanted to use the HOA as a weapon, then then I would use their rules against her. I did a deep dive into their regulations and, to my absolute delight, discovered something interesting. Karen had been violating HOA rules herself. She had a shed that was 2 feet over the allowed property line. She had decorative garden gnomes that exceeded the approved neighborhood aesthetic. And the best part? Her ATV itself wasn't even registered with the HOA, a violation that came with hefty fines. Armed with this information, I sent a formal complaint to the HOA board. The response was swift. Within days, Karen was hit with multiple violations, each accompanied by a fine. She was furious, of course, but the rules were the rules. And for once, they were being enforced against her. The next time I saw her, she was stomping around her yard, muttering under her breath as she angrily yanked her gnomes out of the soil, one by one. She caught sight of me watching from my porch and glared. "Enjoying this?" she snapped. I grinned. "Actually, yeah. A little." Karen stormed inside, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in weeks, my property was finally ATV-free. But something told me Karen wasn't done yet. A few days passed in relative peace. No ATVs, no screaming, no Karen revving through my yard like she was training for the X Games. It was almost too quiet. I knew she wasn't the type to just give up, especially not after getting hit with HOA fines. And I was right. One evening, as I was grilling on my back porch, I spotted her pacing near the edge of my property. She wasn't on her ATV this time, no doubt because it had been officially banned by the HOA, but she was clearly up to something. Then she made her move. With the speed and stealth of a cartoon villain, she began hammering a wooden sign into the ground. I walked over, still holding my spatula, and squinted at it. "No trespassing, private HOA." I burst out laughing. "Seriously? You think a homemade sign changes property laws?" She spun around, arms crossed. "It's official. The HOA said so." "No, they didn't," I said, pulling out my phone. "In fact, they just ruled that you were the one trespassing." "Want me to send you a copy of the letter?" Karen's face twitched. She snatched the sign from the ground and stomped off without another word. That should have been the end of it. But Karen never let things go. The next day she took things to the next level. A group of HOA members gathered in the community park for their monthly meeting. I didn't usually attend these, but when Chad messaged me saying, "You might want to show up for this one," I knew something was about to go down. I arrived to find Karen standing in front of a small crowd, passionately waving a stack of papers. "This neighborhood has standards," she was saying. "And certain people are bringing down the value of our homes." I frowned. She wasn't just ranting, she was holding a petition. "As many of you know," she continued dramatically, "we've had an issue with trespassing and harassment. I've personally been stalked and targeted in my own neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean on my property?" Karen ignored me. "Which is why I am officially submitting this petition to have problem homeowners removed from the community." I looked around. Nobody was clapping. In fact, most people looked either confused or deeply uncomfortable. Chad raised a hand. Karen, what exactly do you mean by removed?" She lifted her chin. "People who disrupt the peace should be forced to sell their homes." I blinked. "You want to evict me from my own house? The house I own? Because you got fined?" She turned bright red. "You were aggressive. I walked behind you. You followed me. On my property." Her mouth opened and closed, but she had no rebuttal. Chad snatched the petition from her hands and flipped through it. "Karen, there are literally 0 signatures on this." Her jaw clenched. "That's because people are scared." "Of what?" "A guy barbecuing on his own deck," someone else muttered. Karen looked around, realizing she had absolutely no support. Then, with as much dignity as she could muster, she snatched the papers back, mumbled something about corruption, and stormed off. The HOA members turned to me. One of them, an older woman named Linda, sighed. "We've been trying to deal with her for years." Chad nodded. "She's filed more complaints than every other homeowner combined." "And how many of them were valid?" I asked. Linda chuckled. "None. The board took an official vote right then and there." Karen was placed on HOA probation, meaning any further rule violations would result in even steeper fines that included any future unauthorized ATV joyrides. That should have been the final nail in the coffin. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat. No, she had one more scheme up her sleeve. A few weeks passed and for the first time in ages things were quiet. No roaring ATV, no pointless screaming, no dramatic HOA meetings where Karen tried and failed to evict me from my own property. It was almost peaceful. Almost. Then one morning a city zoning official knocked on my door. "Are you aware that there's a zoning complaint filed against your property?" he asked, clipboard in hand. I blinked. "What?" He handed me a notice. "Someone reported that your property line extends onto HOA-maintained land." I barely stopped myself from laughing. "Let me guess, Karen?" The official sighed. "I can't disclose that information, but you're not the first person in this neighborhood to get a suspiciously similar complaint." I shook my head. "Well, this is my private land. I have the deed to prove it." "Then this should be a quick review," he said, already looking exhausted. Sure enough, after checking the records, the zoning official confirmed that my property was exactly where it was supposed to be. The complaint was completely bogus. But then plot twist. "Funny thing," the official said, flipping through his documents. "It actually looks like her property is in violation." I frowned. "Come again." He tapped his clipboard. "Her fence and shed? They extend 2 feet into public land." I stared at him. "You're telling me that Karen, the same woman who has spent months screaming about HOA rules and property lines, has been breaking zoning laws herself this whole time?" "Looks like it." It took everything in me not to double over laughing. A few days later another city official arrived, this time to deliver Karen a notice. Apparently her little zoning violation meant she had 2 choices: pay to have her fence and shed moved legally onto her own property, or face a serious fine. Karen, being Karen, naturally refused to accept reality. Instead of fixing the problem, she tried to argue with the city about why the rules didn't apply to her. It went about as well as you'd expect. Within 2 weeks she was forced to pay thousands in fines. And the best part? Because she ignored the first notice, she also had to pay extra for non-compliance. Rumors spread quickly. The once feared HOA Karen was now the biggest rule breaker in the neighborhood. Her rage was nuclear. The day she finally caved and had her fence torn down, she was furious. I watched from my porch as she stomped around her yard, barking at the workers moving her shed. She caught sight of me watching and shot me a look so intense it could have melted steel. "Happy now?" she snapped. I sipped my coffee. Ecstatic. For the next few weeks, Karen tried her best to pretend she still had the upper hand. She avoided me at all costs, but the neighborhood had turned against her. Even her fellow HOA members wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Then one day the "for sale" sign appeared in her yard. It happened fast. Whether it was the fines, the public embarrassment, or the fact that no one took her nonsense seriously anymore, Karen had finally had enough. Within a month she was gone. The HOA held a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate. Not officially, of course, but the timing was suspiciously perfect. Even Chad, the HOA board member, clinked his beer against mine and grinned. "Neighborhood's been a lot quieter lately, huh?" It was over. Karen was gone. Peace had finally returned. But just when I thought life had settled back to normal, a moving truck pulled into Karen's old driveway. I watched as a woman stepped out, stretching and surveying the house. She caught me looking and waved. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood," I said. She smiled. "Thanks. I just moved in. My name's Karen." I froze. She laughed. "Don't worry, not that kind of Karen." I exhaled, relieved. Maybe this one wouldn't come with an ATV.